Hello, I'm Lee, and I'm an end-of-life or death doula, not to be confused with a perhaps more commonly known birth doula, because they deal with hatchings rather than dispatchings. The word doula comes from Greek, meaning a woman of service, and I have to start off by admitting that it's a term that I really don't like, but one that I've been saddled with. In Brighton, where I live, we have lots of death doulas, and rightly or wrongly, birth doulas, rightly or wrongly, that term has come to become associated ever so slightly with sort of a slight middle-class hippie-ishness. And also people don't really know what it means. What does the word doula mean? Whereas if I said I'm an end-of-life companion, I think more people would be able to get an immediate handle on what that role might involve. If it wasn't quite so Harry Potter-ish, I think I would personally prefer the term amicus mortis, which means a friend in death, because who wouldn't want one of those? I did my diploma and training with Living Well, Dying Well, who are a Lewis-based foundation, and I'm a member of the End of Life Doula UK Association, which is a network of doulas all around the UK. What do we do? I'm kind of assuming I'm talking to you as if you don't know what a death doula is. So if you know all about this, you'll have to bear with me. But lots of people, when I talk about what I do, have not heard that term before. We support and accompany people with a life-limiting illness and their friends and families. It's not a new concept, and actually Liz mentioned women in the community in days gone by laying people out, and it was always a woman. The work we do was traditionally carried out by somebody in the community long before people's dying was supported by national organisations. It was really only a few years ago, or not very far down the line, that people were still largely dying at home. And now that death has become more medicalised, more institutionalised, and is often hidden behind closed doors, it's not really surprising that we've lost the language with which to talk about death easily, let alone deal with it in our midst in the community. So death doulas, we're not experts, we don't pretend to be experts, we're not there to take the place of any existing services, rather we're there to fill in the gaps for people. We walk alongside the person we're walking with, and we try to maintain a consistent and flexible presence, providing practical, emotional, and if it's wanted, spiritual support. You've probably heard of lots of people who go through existential crisis at the end of life, and this is something that we work with quite a lot. For that reason, with the same as lots of other counselling roles, lots of our training is concerned with really delving into our own relationships with death and facing our own mortality head on before we can help other people with that. It's a bit like that scenario in an aeroplane when the oxygen masks drop down. You're always told you need to put your own oxygen mask on first before you can help anyone else, which is kind of a weird concept because you're coaching somebody for something that you can never go through first to help them with that idea. So it's quite a leap of faith. We get involved with people at any stage. Sometimes it might be around the time of diagnosis. Sometimes it's not right up until the last few weeks or months of their life. And we try to guide people through any of the decisions and choices, which are multiple, signposting and researching things for them, which can be quite handy if you're in the midst of crisis or in the midst of illness and you're knackered and you're emotionally fraught. It's sometimes quite useful to have somebody to go and look up all the boring stuff for you, signpost you in the right way. We act as a point of contact for other services and kinds of support, and sometimes that might just be enlisting neighbours and friends to come and help. I'm sure we've all at some point wanted to help a friend who's ill, and I know I've been guilty of sending texts or a card with a very vague message, give us a shout if you need any help. So what do? Sometimes you go with a casserole. I know of dying people who've had so many casseroles delivered to them that their freezers can't cope with people's generosity. So it might just be simply a case of identifying what that family's needs are. It might be that they want kids taken to ballet, they might want somebody to take a turn at sitting in with chemotherapy sessions, it might be that they want the dog walking. That's something I'm never going to do because I don't do dog poo, but I'm perfectly happy to organise other people to go and do that. We can help navigate through health and social care systems, and sometimes we accompany people to appointments. If you've been blasted with loads of really frightening, difficult information at an appointment, it's sometimes useful to have somebody there who's just one stage removed, who can take that information in for you and help you digest it afterwards. Sometimes people go to appointments and they're just sent out into the corridor in a complete daze without remembering anything that's been said to them at all. And we do other practical stuff with people, like doing bits of housework, preparing meals and domestic administration. But the most important part really of the job is to sit and talk and to listen to people so that death can be approached without fear or a feeling of loneliness. I think this is particularly important for people who are isolated and don't have friends and family around them who can help them go through these difficult experiences. It's just as important to talk to people about life, because dying is just a small part of that. And towards the end of life, lots of people want to make sense of some of the experiences they've been through, clear up any loose ends, and just kind of make sense of the journey that they've been on. So it's not all just about sitting on Cath Kidston bedspreads at the end of people's beds, holding their hands and looking into their eyes as they drift off into the ever after. A lot of it is a bit more practical than that, and we will really do what anyone wants us to do. Sometimes that connection carries on with a family after somebody has died. Liz has talked about the rise in DIY funerals, and lots of death doulas have been getting involved with helping families to prepare funerals that they do themselves for the person that's died. As doulas, we all come with different approaches. There are some that are very serene and guru-like, and others who are a bit more irreverent. And we've all got different things that we bring to the role. We quite often use stuff that we've used in our everyday life. So in my other life, I'm a musician, and I use that quite a lot with people that I work with. I almost didn't do this job because I thought I'd be out deathing in the middle of the night all the time, and I was thinking, you know, what happens? You can't die on a Wednesday because I've got a gig. It's not going to work. But it doesn't work like that. There's a lot more to it than just that last moment of death. The main thing really, with the same with lots of counselling roles and anything to do with end of life, is that it's all about being person-centred and looking at a person not as a collection of symptoms or a problem to be solved, or somebody that is just dying. They are still living, and they're living as well as they can, and that's what we aim to help them with, right up until that last breath. It's important to remember that anybody we're dealing with has had different emotions, different social connections, and it's all playing into what their experience of the dying process is going to be. I've worked with various different people. There's a real range of people that you meet, which is a great part of the job, and also how involved you become. So I've had one client that I've been working with for over a year now. She's lasted a lot longer than she was expected to, much to her disappointment. And she has collected a large team of doulas around her. She calls us the sisterhood, which is a little bit worrying because I think we sound a bit like a coven of witches. She's very frustrated that she's still here, and a large part of our role is to try and find things that she is still interested in. At the other end of the spectrum, I worked with one man who I was called in to speak to. He was a homeless person who was dying in a hostel in Brighton. And I spent a mere 3 hours with him. But the 3 hours that we spent together, we luckily formed a very quick bond over a shared love of punk. And he was able to use that time to tell me all his fears about death, some of his regrets about his life. We looked at making plans for writing letters to his family who he was estranged from. He wanted gig tickets sorted out, which was something I was easily able to do. He wanted to share his poetry with his friends after he died, so he was quite surprised that that was something in my remit, that I could get poems put on the internet for him. And most of all, he really wanted a big party, a big piss-up to say goodbye to everybody. and was again quite surprised that that was something that came into my role. I think he thought a death doula was going to be some sort of really something very posh. Unfortunately, he died before I got to the next appointment, but the hostel staff noted that just after 3 hours of being listened to, being seen as a person who had aspirations in his life and concerns about his death, they said he completely changed in the days afterwards and he let go. He died before I got to the next appointment, as I said, and he had chosen to send all of his friends away after they'd said goodbye. He sent the nurse away who'd been in to tell him that yes, he was in the active dying phase. And he actually chose to die, as he'd lived much of his life, alone in his room at the hostel, which might not be all of our choice. But the most amazing thing about that for me is that he had control. He decided what he wanted to do, and for one of the first times in his life, ironically, he had control about how he was going to end it, which was a great thing. So there's a real range of people that you meet, which is good, because I like talking to people. Why did I become a death doula? Well, I'm going to put it bluntly, I've got a lot of dead friends. There was a bit of a time when it became a bit embarrassing and people started shuffling away from me. I became a little muttering about black widows. I'm not being glib. There's no shortcut to grieving. If you go through death with people, you can prepare for it. And what I gradually found is that talking to my dying friends, talking about my own grief, talking with other people about their grief, about people that they had who died, and also breaking bad news to lots of people. I run choirs, and we seem to have had an inordinate number of people who've died suddenly and quite young. It was never fun doing all this stuff, but I realised that actually I felt quite comfortable doing it. It's not something I feel awkward around. What I do feel awkward around is if people put their head to one side and talk in very hushed tones about how sorry they are that so-and-so has passed or gone on to another place or didn't make it or lost the battle. I've always been very black and white about using proper terms. If someone's dead, they're dead. And that's, sometimes people find that quite shocking, but that's one of the reasons I wanted to find a role where I could look at trying to get people talking just a little bit more openly about death. I've got a real thing about the superstition that we seem to have in our society about if you talk about death, it's somehow inviting it in. If you stick your fingers in your ears and sing la 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 la, I'm not listening, it's not going to happen. We are all going to die, and we need to face up to that. The last thing that sort of led me into the path of becoming a death doula was, as it often is with people, was one particular death, which in my case was my mum's death. It was really beautiful. It was surprisingly beautiful. She'd had hideous Alzheimer's for 14 years, but her death couldn't have been more perfect, and it was a real surprise to me. It wasn't what I was expecting. It was the first time I'd watched somebody die. And I had that death all to myself. I was alone with her. It almost didn't go that way because I have several brothers and sisters, and one sister in particular is very unusual. Her way of dealing with my mother's death was to burst into the room, and she decided to create a representation of all the missing family members with jelly babies. So there we were, she was getting out each of, this one's Chris, and your brother can't be here, so he's going to be the green jelly baby. Lined them all up round the bed. But that was her way of dealing with it. I broke my tooth clenching my jaw that day, trying not to punch her and karate kick the jelly babies out. I will admit that I did eat them when she nipped out of the loo. Apart from that, the death was just unbelievably beautiful. That's all I can say. It sounds a strange thing to say about death, and that's not always the case. Death can be messy, it can be awkward, but that was really beautiful, and it just got me thinking, is there a way we can support more people to have peaceful endings but without the jelly babies? And that's where I went into the death doula. So I looked around at various options, and I thought to myself, I'm used to hanging out with dying people, check. I like talking about death, check. and I'm really nosy, ideal job. And that's what took me there. As well as seeing clients on a regular basis, we do other things like running death cafes. Have any of you been to death cafes before? If you haven't, get yourself down to one. It's really good fun. It's basically a bunch of strangers collected together, drinking tea, eating cake, talking about anything to do with death and dying. What's not to like? And the other important part of our job, which I did just want to briefly touch on before I finish, is about advanced planning, which is something that Liz has touched on as well. Liz has talked about asking you what you'd like for your funeral. I'd like to go one stage back. What would you like for your death? It's a strange concept, but the more we make plans, the more in control we are about what happens to us at the end. And I think that's particularly important in today's climate, where the overriding feeling seems to be prolonging life for as long as possible, even if that's at the cost of quality of life. So we talk to people about putting plans in place with making sure they've got wills and lasting powers of attorney, making sure they've made funeral plans, digital legacy, which Liz spoke about, what you want to do about organ and tissue donation. And most importantly, thinking about advanced decisions to refuse treatment. Is there anything that you would not want to happen to you if you weren't able to speak for yourself? You can also write an advanced statement of wishes about how you would like to be treated if you can't be speaking for yourself. Mine is perhaps a little bit fanciful. Who can say that I will definitely be swathed from head to toe in cashmere, in my own bedroom, which of course is filled with fresh flowers and a conveniently placed blackbird singing on the roof. But I'll tell you one thing for sure, my sister will not be allowed to. And the way I will make sure is to make sure that I have on hand a death doula, an amicus mortis. Thank you.
Thank you very much.